All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Appreciate everybody joining us, uh, taking time out of your busy year end. We know it's a busy time of the year, but we're excited to have Jeff Jones and Brad Campbell present to us the fiduciary planning process. I'm Scott Jones and Adam Ironman. We're with CKE Financial Services and Raymond James, and I'll kind of just give you a little bit of an update of who we are and what we do, and then we'll get into the presentation. We are going to have a recording, so we can distribute a recording if you want to pass it along to any other members of your committee or staff. We'll post that out on our website as well as redistribute it to those who registered. If you want to ask a question, there's Q&A box out on the Zoom webinar. You can just type it in, and we'll try to answer those at the end. But Adam and myself, we're with CKE Financial Services. We work with our institutional clients. So we have kind of two sides of our house. We have institutional corporate clients, and then we have wealth management clients. And so we work with about 100 institutional entities, businesses. Majority are corporate retirement plans, 401ks, 403bs, but we also serve foundations, endowments, and different types of institutional organizations. And so, easiest way to think about that, I think, is when you think about the institutional space, it's really kind of a group of people making decisions on behalf of other people. And so, rather than just one person's assets, it's a collective. And so, with that, many of you have worked with us, and we appreciate your business, and you're familiar with kind of our quarterly review process and minutes and agendas and all those kind of things. But we always think it's important to kind of bring in third-party experts, and we're excited to bring in who we have today to kind of go over the fiduciary planning process. We also have guides that we'll be distributing, and Brad, who's joined us today, is a co-author of this guide. And so with that, I'll hand it over to you, Jeff, and kind of you can tee it up. And Brad is one of the top ERISA attorneys in the country, and we're happy and he could join us today. So thanks again, Brad.
Happy to do it.
Hey, Scott, thank you very much. And great to be here, guys. Just an FYI, when you get that guide from Adam and Scott, you may want to write it down now and then write it on that guide when you get it. But this is going to qualify as an hour fiduciary training, even if we don't run an hour. And in the DOL audits lately, the DOL is asking how many hours of fiduciary training have you had, and they're looking for one. So you're about to get one. And we will not keep it boring. Brad does not do that. But write down today's date, 1 hour, and put it out Adam and Scott's name, just so you've got it. If you do have a discussion with the DOL or such, that you have this in your fiduciary file in the office. So again, write it down now, or simply once you get the guide from Adam and Scott, write all this on the back and stick it in your file, so you've got what we discussed as well as the date and time. So Brad and I have been working together. I'm with Federated Investors. Brad and I have been working together since he left politics when he was the Assistant Secretary of Labor under George W. Bush for EBSA. So he wrote many of the guides and regulations that we are stuck with at this point. Most are pretty decent, and I've told Brad that
I was
before.
gonna say some of them I wouldn't say stuck with. Some of them are helpful, but okay, fine.
Yes, yes. As you can see, we've traveled together for well over a decade. But Brad, besides still now practicing at Drinker at Faegre Drinker, is also been working with us since that day, presenting on fiduciary planning, writing our materials and such. And this is a really cool piece we put together just to go through what your roles are as a plan sponsor, because no matter who you hire as your trustees, as your record keepers, you still have a fiduciary responsibility. So, and Brad will go more into that. But it's important that you do go through and understand what your responsibilities are, what happens if you breach those fiduciaries, and hopefully we can give you some help with that. So today, Brad's going to go through the presentation. He will let me know there's only 12 slides, and we're already on number one, and so I promise we'll go quickly. But I will jump in if it sounds appropriate, and when Brad tells me to, I'll change the page. But with that, let me introduce the Honorable Bradford P. Campbell.
Well, thanks, Jeff. And more importantly, thanks to all of you for deciding to come here today. Because I got to tell you, the number one impulse that will keep a fiduciary out of trouble is recognizing that there are things that you don't know that you might need to know, and that talking to people who can help you with that, asking questions is going to be the thing that makes it work well for you. I think we throw all these legal terms around about, fiduciary and liability and all the ERISA terminology, and we throw 408(b)(2) disclosures and all that kind of stuff at you. But when you really boil it down, what you're doing as a fiduciary is taking care of other people's money, right? So you have to do that a certain way. And it's not that there's some magical rocket science that you have to follow. If you really think about it, a lot of this comes down to, are you asking the kind of questions that are necessary to really understand what's happening? Are you doing your due diligence so that you can show that you made decisions the right way? You asked the right questions, you gathered the right information. And the neat little thing, and as we go through this, you'll see why we have all these various steps that we suggest you take. The reason is the beauty, so to speak, of ERISA is that you don't have to be right all the time. You can be wrong without being liable as long as you're wrong the right way. And I think that's one of the things that people have trouble wrapping their heads around in this space. Your job as a fiduciary isn't to always pick winning investments. It isn't to always have everything be, rainbows and sunshine. It's to make decisions following a prudent, thorough, and well documented process so that those decisions are made the right way, so that they're deemed to be prudent, and therefore you've fulfilled your duty. And so, if you really think of it that way, break it down as this is really about a process. This is about putting in place a structure that'll help you do things the right way. And by doing them the right way, you've done them correctly, even if markets tank and all sorts of bad things can happen. So it's really kind of important to know this fiduciary process really is your protection, as well as a way of doing things that's going to be systematic and has a better likelihood of getting you better outcomes, which is really what all of us are hoping for in our retirements. That's the last thing I'll say as a general overview before we get into the details, which is you all are people who want to do things the right way. None of you are offering a 401(k) plan or similar 403(b) plan, whatever it is, to your employees because you don't like your employees and you don't want them to succeed. I mean, these are your colleagues, your coworkers, yourselves are in these plans. You want them to work. And the key is to work with good people who can help you get that done. So with all that out of the way, let me just throw one more thought before we get into this. And I know I already promised that was my last pre-thought, but hey,
But
all
you're
right,
an attorney.
I'm allowed to change my mind. The last pre-thought I'll just say is this year is starting already to be quite a lot of change in the retiree space. In particular, we're seeing a lot of new activity coming from the Department of Labor, a little less from the IRS, but we're going to see a whole bunch of new things coming in the next year or two. And so now is a really good time to look at what's our basic structure. Do we have our four walls covered here? Do we have a good fiduciary base established? So that when the Labor Department puts out some new regulations on how fiduciaries make some investment decisions, or if we're looking at some of the new issues that are going to be coming up in the next 12 to 18 months, that you've got the base built to handle those things properly and be ready. And it's not just going to be on retirement plans. For those of you on this call who also have some health plan responsibility, you should know the Labor Department is going to start new disclosure rules regarding pharmacy benefit managers. They're going to be putting out some changes to mental health parity and substance abuse equity. I mean, across the board in benefits, it's going to be an eventful couple of years. So that now is the time to really get those basics covered and move forward. And with that, Jeff, now finally, let us move to the first slide.
Hey, before we move on, should we chat at all about the catch-up contribution, or is that something we would do?
You're right. Let's do that right now. There's been some confusion on this. So let's just take 2 minutes to reset. And I'm hopeful that all of you here have already fixed this, but let's bring it up because if you haven't, now's the time to work on it. In the Secure 2.0, one of the ways they raised some money to do some of the other good things that were in there is they tinkered with the taxation of catch-up contributions, right? So these are for workers who are nearer retirement, who are allowed to put extra money in their 401ks or 403bs. And what the law said is, well, if those folks make enough money, or another way of thinking it is if they make too much money, we're going to say they can make catch-up contributions, but only on a Roth basis. So traditional basis means, I make a contribution in my 401k plan. Let's say I put 10,000 in my 401k. That reduces my taxable income by 10,000, right? So as a participant, I don't pay taxes on the money I put in my plan. That's a traditional 401k contribution. The Roth contribution is the opposite. I'm taxed on my income, then I contribute. Well, technically I contribute first, but it's post-tax money I'm contributing. But in return, it grows in my Roth account tax-free. I don't have future tax when I take the money out. Traditional, I get a tax break on the front end, I pay taxes on the back. Roth, I pay taxes on the front end, get a tax break on the back. They set it up so that these catch-up contributions for folks who make, and the number is now 150,000 or more, they can do catch-up contributions, but only if they are Roth. So for some plan sponsors, many of whom don't have or didn't prior to this have a Roth feature in their plan, it was traditional only, this was presenting a compliance problem. So if you're still in that boat, if you have employees who are going to make catch-up contributions starting in January, and if you paid them more than $150,000 in FICA wages, in other words, if you look at how Social Security taxes are applied, that's how you calculate the 150,000. If you have somebody who last year you paid 150,000 or more to, and next year, 2026, they are going to make catch-up contributions, they can only do that if it's Roth in your plan. So if you haven't figured out how to do that yet, you need to have a conversation because what the IRS said, and this is a little confusing, the law applies January 1 of 26, but the new IRS rules about exactly how to do it apply January 1, 27. That doesn't mean you can wait until 27 to solve the problem. It means that you have to do something in 26 to try to comply, even though you don't have to be in full compliance with all of the details of the IRS rule until 27. So hopefully you're all already dealt with this and this is all old hat to you, but we've been throwing it out there everywhere because, it's a big world. There's lots of plans and there's always, some folks who might need last minute assistance. But, Adam, Scott, should we, do you all want to say anything about that or you want us to move on?
No, I would just say we have been bringing that up in quarterly review meetings, and I think it's clients are engaging, they're reaching out to the people that applies to, and making them aware of that. But I think the trick is more on different. It seems like different record keepers have different processes, and so they all aren't the same, and some have ways to flag these participants in the system to say, hey, this person shouldn't be making a pre-tax Roth, right? Something's wrong here. Whereas some others are just kind of putting that completely on the clients and the payroll company to figure out. So I think your point is spot on to have a process to identify those folks, communicate the changes to those folks, and then not wait until you're caught off and surprised, by that.
Yeah, basically, the standard the IRS is going to apply for 2026 is kind of good faith compliance. So, what does that mean? Well, it's kind of fuzzy. It means that, as you were saying, Scott, if you discover that something's not going right, you need to try and fix it. But as you also, Scott, you're exactly right. We're seeing the same things. Record keepers are all handling this differently, and there is a lot of confusion there. So definitely something to pay attention to. So, Jeff, good catch letting us throw that up first, because that's good practical advice as opposed to some of our, more theoretical discussions that will follow a bit. All right. So with that, let's get into the broad overview of what we're talking about. And I apologize. I'm going to have to throw on my glasses to even read the screen here. It's the disadvantage of getting old, I guess. So basically, we've broken this down into just kind of five simple steps, and we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on it. But step one is figure out what it is why are you having a plan? What are you trying to do? How much involvement do you want to have? There's some, various ways you can structure plans that either require more or less attention, that have more or less complexity. These are all decisions you get to make. So kind of step one, what do you want to do with this plan and how involved do you want to be and kind of what's your goal as a fiduciary? Step two is, and then we'll spend probably some time on this, exactly what does that mean? What is it you're supposed to do when you are a fiduciary and how do you do that? Step three is where we start getting into some more practical issues, which is okay, our committees and our investment policy statements and the charter and the bylaws. Like, what structure do we put in place and how do we operate this stuff to make sure we're doing things the right way? And to help us do that, step four, we talk about let's look ahead and plan out the year with a calendar, right? Let's kind of know what the big deadlines are and what they're coming. And then step five is actually once we've got all that in place, are we running it right on an ongoing basis? We built the plan, we built the structure. Now are we running the whole thing properly? So that's kind of the big overview of some of what we'll talk about today. All right, so your fiduciary goals, and there's a whole lot of text here.
Sorry, Brad. You wrote it.
I know. Well, hey, the unfortunately the reality is there's a lot of stuff to ERISA. As you all know from your real lives, there's a lot of moving parts to running some of these plans, and that's one of the reasons why one of the key things that you need to remember is you need to know that there's things you don't know, and you need to work with partners, various service providers, with record keepers who know what they're doing, with your advisors who are going to help you know what you're doing, because they have the experience to help guide you through all of these things. And I don't want to bog down on this too much, but some of the key fiduciary issues that you're going to have to look at is, as we'll talk about more, what is it I'm supposed to be doing? And how do we set up the structures to do that? And how, for example, one category that sort of stands by itself is investments, right? Are our investments, how do we decide what should be on the menu? How do we oversee that process? Who do we get assistance from? That's kind of, there's a whole separate little area that's just the investment parts. But there are other parts that you have responsibility as fiduciaries for running. So are your participants getting the disclosures and notices they're supposed to get? Are you, dealing with them appropriately so that they're able to exercise their rights and responsibilities in the plan? So there's kind of that administrative side as well. And then, of course, you have to keep your eye on the fact that the ball is always moving slightly. I alluded to the beginning that we're going to have some regulatory changes coming up. So, as part of our fiduciary goals, we need to make sure that we have a way to keep abreast of what's happening. And again, a lot of that in practice really does rest with who are you working with? Are they knowledgeable in ERISA? Do they know what they're doing? I'll just give you a quick example. You don't have to hire a financial advisor if you have the in-house expertise to do all that correctly. At the same time, most plans do have a financial advisor because that stuff is complicated, and most of us aren't actually, investment sufficiently expert in investment decisions to feel comfortable doing that. That's an example of where you need to know what you don't know. Now I'm trying to remember. I think it was. I used to think it was John Wayne, but I actually think it was Clint Eastwood in one of the Dirty Harry movies who said a man has to know his limitations. And I think that's kind of a key lesson for a fiduciary to remember. Jeff, I'm going to ask you for a comment here, just to put you on the spot.
Okay, well, I was going to ask you if you want to go into the reasonableness of fees, which is a big
Yes.
that comes up in these conversations.
That is one of my favorite soapboxes to jump on. And here's why. We have this myth that's out there, and it's kind of pushed by, you probably hear about ERISA litigation and how some plans are getting sued, and a lot of these sues are about fees. Are our fees too high? What are our fees? Are they reasonable? Let's take a minute to really understand what that means. The duty you have as a fiduciary under the law is to pay only reasonable fees for necessary services. So I want to really be clear, reasonable is not cheapest. You do not have an obligation to pay the cheapest fee. And the best example that I know of to really illustrate this is one that we've all faced at one time or another, which is hiring a contractor to build something. If I'm going to redo my kitchen, I am not going to hire the cheapest contractor just because they're the cheapest contractor. If I do, I'm going to have a giant hole in my house where my kitchen used to be for the next 18 months while the guy never shows up and we fight about it and everyone's unhappy. That's what happens if you pick the cheapest without taking into account all the other relevant factors. And that's what you have to do as a fiduciary is pay a reasonable fee. So I have to look at it and I have to take fees into account. I absolutely have to know what my fees are. I have to look at them, I have to understand them, but I have to look at them in the context of for what I'm getting, is this a reasonable fee for this service? So I'm looking at it in the totality. It's not a point, it's a zone, is the easiest way to think about it. So when I'm interviewing that contractor for my kitchen, I'm wanting to know their experience. I'm wanting to get referrals to find out if they show up and do the work. I want to find out if they do good work. If I live in a high-rise condo versus a 200-year-old farmhouse, I have different issues in redoing my kitchen. I want to make sure that that contractor is familiar with the kind of kitchen I have. So when I go through and evaluate what the fee is for that work, it's taking into account all of those things, and it needs to be reasonable. I'm not paying excessive fees, but it does not have to be the cheapest. And I think that's really an important lesson for all of us to remember. And again, the way you assess reasonableness is you actually have to gather the data. So we might be jumping ahead a little bit, but since we're here, let's just talk about it. When you're hiring a service provider for your plan, you're going to probably want to use a request for proposal process where you're saying, hey, this is what we want done. You all give us bids where we can do apple to apple comparisons so we can understand your fees and we can compare them to others and compare them to the services to come out of that.
Brad, I had a question, I guess, on that a little bit. What we're starting to see a lot of is providers not necessarily playing games with pricing, but there are margins in different ways that these providers and 401ks can make money through, for example, managed accounts or a proprietary target date fund that they manage. Also, capturing retirees' rollover dollars in their own house IRAs. And so I feel like it's getting more difficult for plan sponsors to do an apples to apples comparison because of all the different ways providers can increase margins through stable value products and things like that. So do you have any kind of ideas or kind of things for clients to maybe think about when they're doing that?
Yeah, this is actually a really good point because, as you say, fees are not always easy to figure out what the apple to apple comparison is, right?
Yeah.
You've got fees that are built into, well, I've assumed you're going to use my proprietary product and therefore my fee I'm expressly showing to you is X, but I'm also in, and maybe X looks lower than somebody else, but that's because I'm also making money in the investment related to that. Really, one of the best ways frankly, most plan fiduciaries can deal with that is by working with investment advisors who really understand all those ways those things are structured, because that can get complex. So work
Right.
with an advisor who knows how to pull those numbers apart and help you understand what you're actually paying. Again, this is not just the investment part, because making investment decisions for investment reasons is its own set of skills, but experience with those fee arrangements so you can understand what you're actually paying for is helpful as well.
And I was going to say, I know, Brad, you've already talked about it and we'll continue to talk about process and the importance of the process more so than the actual decision. But something also to keep in mind is if you didn't write it down, it didn't happen.
Yes.
When you're having your committee meetings, when you're getting together with Adam and Scott, make sure you've got notes from the meeting that talk about we reviewed the fees and here's what we saw. Because again, if you don't know your fees, that's a prohibitive transaction. So you need to know your fees, you need to understand them, you need to understand everything. But again, if you don't write it down, it didn't happen. So I just want to make sure you got that out there.
Yeah, and that's a great point. Let's talk about that. There's actually a regulation that says, and this is one of the rules we started when I was there, although if you don't like how it ended up, we can blame the Obama folks because they tweaked it a little. All right. But no, there's a regulation that kind of protects fiduciaries, and it was done on purpose. And what it says is when you're hiring a service provider, they have to disclose to you their direct fees, like what they're going to charge you directly that you're paying them. They also have to make sure you know whether they're acting as a fiduciary. So if they're a fiduciary, they have to say, yes, I'm a fiduciary. And we'll get into the different types of fiduciaries and when you might hire one in a second. And they have to say indirect compensation. Is somebody else paying me in connection with your business? And the reason that regulation is there is as a fiduciary, you have a duty to pay only reasonable fees and you have to understand those fees. But prior to that regulation, there wasn't a corresponding duty for the service provider to be transparent. And so there is now an obligation, and this is what's called the 408B2 disclosure, because we in ERISA love really clear headlines. 408B2 obviously references statutory citation. That's the name of the technical name of the disclosure that you're supposed to get in advance of deciding to hire somebody. Now, Scott, you're absolutely right. Those disclosures aren't perfect. There are ways that you still have to pull those fees apart to understand them, but there is a duty to get that information. And as Jeff says, you need to have it in your file that you got it, and you need to have looked at it to make sure you understand what's going on. But you're not out there alone swimming on this trying to figure it out. There are rules in place to make sure you get the information that you need, and then you can also get the expert assistance to make sure you can understand it properly. All right, so let's spend just a minute on fiduciary. And it's important to know that this fiduciary thing isn't all encompassing, right? It's not that because I'm on the plan committee, I'm now a fiduciary for everything to everybody all the time. You're a fiduciary to the extent you're doing certain things. Let's break it down this way. There's really three kinds of fiduciaries. There's the named fiduciary in the plan document. So this is your plan document is supposed to identify somebody, and it could be a person, it could be the committee, it could be a job title, and that named fiduciary is actually responsible for everything. They're kind of where the buck stops. Legally, the plan has said this person or committee is in charge of our plan, and they'll be making these decisions and in charge of making sure everything runs the way it's supposed to.
And Brad, if I could quickly add to that, I would not recommend putting a person's name in the document. I would recommend putting in a position or the committee because people retire, people move on, and you forget to change the documents at a later date. So just want to throw that.
That's a great point. And when we get to plan documents in particular, we'll talk about document creep and the fact that it's so easy to not amend your documents, even when you change practices, that can become the mismatch between what your document says you should do and what you're actually doing should not be a mismatch. And this is a great example. If you put in there that Bill Jones is going to be the fiduciary and Bill retired 5 years ago, you got a document problem, and that's not a good thing. And again, it can be the committee or something of that nature. So first of all, named fiduciary, the folks who are in the plan with responsibility. The second is a exercise of fiduciary discretion, fiduciary. This one's important because what it means is the law doesn't want people to wiggle out of being responsible by a job title or a disclaimer, right? So you can't say, well, I'll be the CFO of the company and I'll be on the plan committee, but I'm not going to be a fiduciary. If you do fiduciary things, you are a fiduciary. So if you decide what investment the plan's going to make, you're a fiduciary to the extent you made that decision, even if you say, I'm not a fiduciary when you do it. It's based on what you actually do. And therefore, you can have accidental fiduciaries. And this is one of the reasons we're going to talk about governance and having a committee and charters and all of that, is so that you don't have people accidentally making fiduciary decisions without realizing it. Right? Let's say the committee is on vacation, and so the person in charge of HR, who's not actually a committee member, in my hypothetical, figures, hey, look, we got to submit this contract. I'm going to go ahead and sign off and pick in the new record keeper because, it's just got to get done. That's fine in a way, but because they made that decision, that individual would now be a fiduciary for selecting that record keeper, whether they meant to be or not. And the problem with accidental fiduciaries is if they didn't know they were a fiduciary, they're probably not applying the right process. They probably haven't done things the right way. So Named fiduciary, people with responsibility. Discretionary fiduciary, a to the extent fiduciary, and exercising fiduciary. In other words, someone who does something fiduciary is a fiduciary. Both of those first two categories tend to be people at the company. The third category are essentially investment advisors that you hire. So when I go out and hire an investment advisor, often they're operating as a fiduciary. They typically should be operating as a fiduciary to me. And I don't know, Scott, Adam, do you want to get into right now the two different kinds of investment advice fiduciaries, 321 and 338?
Sure, we can, the 321 versus 338. You can see, and we can provide investment advisory services in both capacities, and we do have clients in both where we act as a 321 or a 338. But I think from our perspective, 321 was a lot more commonplace over the past several decades, and we're starting to see more gravitation towards a full service 338 investment manager. So, usually you can think about it this way is where when we act as a 321 capacity, we're meeting quarterly, we're going through investment reviews, we have investment policy statements. We may put a fund on a watch list, and then the committee kind of votes and decides, hey, based on all the facts and research we have, we think we should change this fund out. And then we work with the record keeper to make a change. So it's kind of a shared, from our understanding, a shared liability when you have a 321 investment fiduciary versus the 338 is really you hiring that investment advisor to make the investment decisions. You still have a fiduciary obligation to monitor that provider and have a process for selecting them, but it's really kind of maybe pushing more of the liability onto the investment manager. So please correct me where I'm off
No,
on that.
that's all exactly right. I'm just going to dumb it down for a second because it always helps me to just remember it this way. 321 advisor, which you're right, has been the most common historically. They tell me what they think I ought to do, and they are fiduciaries for their advice. So they're with me on the liability of saying, we think you ought to do XYZ investment, and we're with you, standing next to you if something, if we all get sued, if you follow our advice. But you decide whether to follow. So 321, they help you. 338, they do it for you. In a 338 scenario, you, the named fiduciary or the committee with investment authority, have said, I will formally delegate to you, investment manager, the right and responsibility to make investment decisions for me. Now, some employers, some plan sponsors like that because they don't want to be involved really. They want to be involved to the minimum extent, so they want somebody else to do it for them. Others like being involved and want to have control over it. What we sometimes see, and Jeff, maybe you can speak to this, every now and then you'll see somebody where the plan says, hey, I like the idea of having someone do it for me. But then when they do it for them, they say, well, yeah, but we still want these four funds because the CEO likes these. You can't mix the two. Either they're helping you and you're deciding, or they're doing it for you. That's really the two basic choices. They're both, by the way, perfectly fine and appropriate, both good choices to make. There's nothing wrong with them. It comes down to what is your style? What does your committee want to do? How much involvement do you want to have? And do you want to, be involved in these decisions, or do you really truly want to delegate them?
Yeah, I would agree. And I think it's interesting. I mean, your point about the four different funds is very spot on because it depends if the committee wants choice. And what we find sometimes is when you have a 338 manager, that firm that is backing that agreement, often doesn't always want to take on a bunch of risks themselves. So what they can kind of do sometimes is water down the list of choices to maybe only index funds or very low cost options. And so if you want flexibility in different asset classes and that makes sense for the committee, you might not be able to do that in a 338 relationship.
Hey, and if I could add to this, and I don't know if we get to it in one of the future slides, but it's important, as Brad mentioned, that second level of fiduciary. Anyone on the committee is a fiduciary, and I've worked in my 40 years with companies that want to get the views of the entire workforce. So they'll put people on the investment committee from all over the company. Maybe you run a printing press or you're in marketing. They're trying to do the exact right thing, make sure they're putting together a menu that the employees think is the right menu. But those employees are now fiduciaries. And it's important that if you're putting someone from marketing or advertising or sales or whatever onto your committee, that they understand their role, that they are a fiduciary, what happens if they breach the role, just to know that they are indeed a named fiduciary.
And then with that, let's segue to the next slide and start getting into what all that means. So, so what are you can kind of boil down the key duties. As I said before, as a fiduciary, you're only supposed to use plan assets to provide benefits and to defray the reasonable expenses of the plan. So this is where we get into, are the fees reasonable? Are you using the plan money for plan purposes? The assets are specially protected. ERISA is an other people's money statute. So when you're putting on your fiduciary hat to make these decisions, you're having to act solely in the interests of the participants and the beneficiaries. You have a duty to follow the plan documents. So if the plan document says thou shalt do X, you got to do X. That's just how that works, unless X is illegal, right? So there's a very limited exception. If your plan document for some reason told you to do something wrong, you couldn't do it. But otherwise, you have a duty to follow the plan documents. You have a duty to pay reasonable fees. You should only use the plan assets for plan purposes. And you have to act solely in the interest of the participants and beneficiaries. The last big duty is all the procedural prudence, all the process part. And that's where it says act with the care, skill, prudence, diligence. And there's a whole long legal paragraph that everyone loves to memorize. Under the circumstances then prevailing that a similar person in like capacity acting in enterprise of like character, like aims. What it boils down to is saying somebody who is in your shoes at your company, right? So your company's fiduciary issues in addressing your 401k plan are probably different than Exxon, or Walmart or some other mega corporation, right? You're looking at your particular plan and your particular circumstance. This whole prudent process part is saying, if I were standing in your shoes having to make your decisions, did I ask the right questions? Did I get the right information to have followed a prudent process to then reach a decision? So it's a little bit of a sliding scale. Even though the duty is legally the same for the head fiduciary of Exxon as it is for the head, just to pick on them for some reason, as it is to, in Bob's Bicycle Shop. The reality is Bob's Bicycle Shop is a lot more simple. It's a lot smaller. There's a lot less, in some ways, expectation, but it doesn't mean you're off the hook. Bob still has to act solely in the interests of his participants. He still has to make sure his fees are reasonable. He still has to do things the right way. He still has to follow the plan documents. So, and the last one, I know I said the process was the last, but also you have a duty to diversify, right? You can't put all the 401k money into, I don't know, Google stock and call it a day. You have to have a diversified menu of investments. And there's more to that. If you want to set it up so that the plan works as a participant-directed individual account plan, which is what a 401k is. In other words, if you want to set it up so that you're picking the plan menu and you're a fiduciary for the plan menu, but the participants make up their own minds and are responsible for their own use of the menu, there's certain requirements you have to follow called 404C. And again, that's where you want to work with advisors and others who can help you through that to make sure you've structured the plan the right way so that you're not responsible if your participants make a bad decision about how to allocate. So there's some structural issues to think of there. So it boils down to you got to act solely in their interest. You got to pay reasonable fees. You can't use the money for non-planned purposes. You got to diversify. Most importantly, you have to have a prudent, thorough, well-documented process in how you make decisions. So, Jeff, to the point you've alluded to a couple of times, well, what happens if you don't do that? What happens if you breach your fiduciary duties? Well, the bad news is you are personally liable to make whole the people who are harmed by your failure. And that can be a failure of omission or commission. So, in other words, I take the money and run to Venezuela, that is a fiduciary breach. I actively did something wrong. Hopefully, we're not getting to that extreme. But let's say, I just didn't prudently select somebody. I just, picked somebody with no process at all to provide a service. I paid them what turned out to be an excessive fee. I just didn't do my due diligence at all. That can also be a fiduciary breach. And again, that goes back to why it's important to have a process that's thorough and well documented. In that case, I can be personally liable for making whole the losses to the plan. Now, the good news here is there are no non-economic damages. There are no punitive damages. There isn't some of these extra things that are out there in other kinds of lawsuits, but you do still have that personal responsibility. And that's one reason I would say, while it's not actually required by ERISA, if you're going to be a fiduciary to an ERISA plan, you ought to look at getting fiduciary liability insurance. It's a policy that's going to cover you when you take those fiduciary acts so that when you're doing things the right way, if you were to get sued, then it would defend you and help pay for your defense to show that you did things the right way. There are also these things Jeff mentioned earlier called prohibited transactions. So there are certain things that you are not allowed to do as a fiduciary at all. So one of them, of course, would be, stealing from the plan, using plan benefits for your own assets, getting kickbacks, saying, well, I'll hire you for the vendor, but only if you give me, $500 and a motorcycle, whatever it is. Those types of things are obviously prohibited transactions. There's some others that are more technical. And a lot of those for the typical plan are addressed by some of the disclosure rules. So don't have to be quite as mindful of all those. But what it comes down to is you have to be honest. You have to act in the interest of the plan. You have to not be benefiting yourself when you're doing these things. And if you were, for example, to do self-dealing, a prohibited transaction where you got a benefit that was inappropriate because you used your position to benefit yourself, not only is that a breach where you'd have to repay that, but there's an excise tax that arises under the tax code. So the IRS can come in and charge you taxes on top of your liability under ERISA for making things whole. So the bottom line is you don't want to do things wrong because there's some reasonably strong penalties in the law. Because again, this is an other people's money statute, right? So this is protecting ordinary workers from you doing bad things with their money and leaving them holding the bag. Last thing I'll mention, and then I'll stop, and the three of you can fill in all the war stories and nuances and things that you've seen. And it's this bottom here. Your normal errors and omissions policy probably does not cover fiduciary liability. You probably need a special rider or a special policy for that. It's worth double checking and asking your insurance broker about this because you want to make sure you have the right coverage if you're going to do it. And go.
No, normally I would get into some of those, but we're running out of time today, Brad. So we've got about 15 minutes left, so I don't want to get into too many stories, but I will tell you back when I was an advisor in Scott and Adam's shoes, I was doing one of these meetings and going through a fiduciary planning process, and one of the guys, and I used the example, ran a printing press and said, so what is my worst case scenario? And it was probably a bit too blunt back when I did this 25 years ago, but I said, I can't tell you because I don't know what you're worth. Just understand what the responsibilities are. Get the insurance if it makes sense in your situation. Something to talk about with Scott and Adam.
All right, next slide. All right, so let's talk about the fiduciary governance process. So again, it's very helpful to work with experts who do this regularly. They can help guide you with the process. But you want to look at saying, okay, well, rather than one person making these decisions, although it can be, and in some companies it really can't be a committee because there just aren't enough people. But in a company that's reasonably, large enough that it makes sense to use a committee structure, make it using a committee makes sense because you get discussion, you get some crosstalk, you have multiple people involved, and you want to do this sort of in a structured way. So you want to meet at least once a year. Now you probably hear that the committee should meet quarterly and this, that, and the other. That is kind of and I hate using the phrase best practice, but that is kind of what a lot of folks say. Committees ought to meet quarterly, and that is what we aim for. You need to know that you should meet no less than annually. And you need to know that if you say in writing, we're going to meet quarterly, but then you don't meet quarterly, that becomes its own problem. So these shouldn't be aspirational goals that we just routinely fail to meet. If you know you're not going to meet quarterly, don't write down that we're going to meet quarterly. So you need to structure a governance process that works for what your plan is actually going to follow. Because when you write down these processes, you need to carry out these processes. So your typical committee meeting, you want to have agenda that goes out. You want to set a date, whether it's in person or virtual. Those are all flexibilities you can have. But people need to have an agenda, know what's coming. Somebody should take minutes of the meeting. The meeting should get a report on the investments. The minutes should discuss the fees of the plan at least once a year. The committee should be looking at, are we satisfied with our various vendors? Are they doing a good job? If we had a problem, were they good at resolving it? And periodically, you need to think about, well, should we be reviewing whether we still want these vendors? How often should we do an RFP is an issue that comes up a lot. If you're satisfied with a vendor, you need to compare their fees to sort of industry benchmarks on a regular basis, preferably annually, but you don't have to go out and recompete a bid every year. That's not necessary at all. At the same time, if you've been with the same vendor for 10 years and you've never looked at the competition, it's probably time to have a more, complete review. And you may keep the vendor. There may not be nothing wrong with them, but you want to do that review periodically, at least every, I don't know, call it 5 years, maybe a little more frequently, to make sure that you're still getting a reasonable fee and good services from your record keeper and your other providers. One big issue, and we'll get into this as well, is minutes. Now that we have AI, I keep seeing a bunch of people wanting to actually literally record the minutes. I can't tell you how much I don't like that, because as a lawyer, all the time I've seen some random email between one guy and another where he makes a bad joke, and now that becomes part of the record and screws everything up for everybody. If you write down a blow-by-blow account of what everybody said in a committee meeting, you're actually recording information that may not be useful to you later. What you want from the minutes of a meeting is a good, solid record showing that we did the right thing and we had a good process. So the agenda says we met and we talked about investments. In the file, you have the report from Scott and Adam that says, here's what your investments are doing, here's what our recommendations are. The minutes should show that you got that report, you had a discussion. If you had an investment on the watch list, you talked about it, and you decided to either keep it on the watch list, take it off, or replace it. It should not say, well, Bill said we should do this, and Sally said we should do that, because inevitably, Bill or Sally, somebody's going to say something you don't want to record for posterity. So make your minutes a good summary of what happened, but I would not advise you to record them literally and just keep an audio record in your file. That's probably not going to help you down the road. And a lesson on investment policy statement, and maybe this is actually the next slide, come to think of it. Can we jump forward here? Okay, well, this is, let's go back to the fiduciary, the oversight, the committee governance. Yeah, this one. Committee meetings, processes, and bylaws. One more up. Sorry. You want to have a way, regardless of which slide it is, here's the concept I'm trying to explain, which is you want to have some kind of governance structure that's written down for your committee. What does it do? How do you get on it? How do you get off it, so that we know what they're responsible for? Like if you have a committee that handles both investment and administration, that's clear. If you have broken that into two committees, one does administration, one does investment only, that's clear. So you need kind of a committee charter that lays out what it does and how people get on it and how they get off it, so that there's clarity about who the fiduciaries are and everybody knows what's going into that. All right, let's go to the investment process slide there. All right, investment monitoring, one back. Investment monitoring and investment process.
Is this it? No.
One more, I think. That one, step 5. All right. So let's talk about investment policy statements for a minute. ERISA does not actually require you to have an investment policy statement, but we typically recommend people do. Why is that? Because it's a blueprint for your process. It says, hey, when we look at investments, here's how we look at them. Here are the kind of factors we're going to take into account. Basically, it lays out what is it we're doing when we think about investments and what's the process we follow. What it should not do is remove your fiduciary discretion. You want an investment policy statement that has a lot of mays and not a lot of shalls. Because what it needs to do is say, here's the means by which, the process by which we make decisions, but it won't lock us into a particular decision. And I'll give you a very concrete example. You may have a fund that's in your plan that's been underperforming for a while. And you look at that and you go, wow, we don't like this history of underperformance. So maybe our investment policy statement says, well, after a certain period of time, we're going to put it on a watch list. Okay, that's pretty common. That's a good process. It means we're taking a look at this one in particular because it hasn't done what we thought it was going to do. But each time it's up to decide whether to retain it, kind of each period during which you're reviewing, whether that's quarterly or annually or whatever. When you look at that, you're actually looking at it fresh, right? It may have underperformed the last, I don't know, 6 quarters because the market went a different direction than we thought. But we as a committee still think this investment is actually right for us because we think the way things are going in the future, this is actually a good diversified part of our portfolio. So even though it's underperformed, we still want to keep it because we think in the potential conditions of the future, this is actually a good investment for our plan in an overall portfolio. Your investment policy statement needs to give you the flexibility to make that decision. If your document says after 8 quarters of underperformance, we will dump the fund, it could be that quarter 9 is actually the time you want to keep the fund. And if your investment policy statement says no, you must dump it, then you've removed your own fiduciary discretion and created a new problem. If you reasonably believe you should have kept it and you keep it, now you're doing the opposite of what your documents and instruments govern the plan say. So that's kind of a long-winded way of saying a good investment policy statement proves your process. It helps you carry out your fiduciary duties, but it preserves for you the flexibility to make the decisions that you believe are the best interest of the plan at the time you have to make them.
And I've seen IPSs that say, must be in the top quartile 3 of the next 5 years or whatever. You don't want that. You don't want to be forced to make decisions that aren't the right fiduciary decisions. So as Brad said, keep it vague and keep it a process.
And I've actually defended a client in a DOL, Department of Labor investigation, where the Department of Labor's primary claim was your investment policy statement says you should have dumped this as of, last year, and you didn't. And we got into a big fight with them about, well, this part of the document said that, but this other part said this. And we ended up winning that, but it was a big problem based solely on the language in that document. DOL would never have questioned them holding that investment, but for the document suggesting they should have gotten rid of it after a specific period of time. So that part's important. And again, it goes to working with advisors and looking at these documents in a way that's going to help you make these decisions.
Hey, Brad, real quick with the 5 minutes we have left, unless you want to do more on investment policy and monitoring, I think you covered that.
I think we're good enough for 5 minutes left, yes.
Okay, so what I was going to say is, do you want to go through a couple of the things that the DOL is looking for lately? What are they finding, whether it's missing participants or you know what we're talking about?
Absolutely. So missing participants, let's spend a moment on that. Who are these people? These are the folks who have been employees of yours. They're in the plan. They are no longer employees of yours. They retired, moved to Florida, whatever they did, but they're still participants. So they're not employees, but they are participants. They have all the same rights and responsibilities as any other participant, but eventually you lose track of them, right? You send them their quarterly benefit statement, it gets returned to sender because they're not at that address anymore. DOL takes the position that if you haven't sort of exhausted reasonable steps to find these folks and stay in contact with them, because you have a duty to furnish them certain disclosures under the law, if you haven't sort of carried out your duty to try in reasonable efforts to find them, if they get to the age where they're supposed to be getting benefits, so in a traditional pension plan, if they're getting to normal retirement age and they should be getting a pension, if it's a 401k and they're now at RMD, required minimum distribution age, and they're not taking RMDs because you don't know where they are and you haven't talked to them for 10 years, DOL has taken the position that that's a breach of your duty. And it's become one of their biggest areas of civil and monetary recoveries. So a lot of their investigations have gone into these missing participants. Well, what can you do about that? You can go through and work with your record keeper, usually is kind of the easiest first step to try and clean this up. Find all the missing participants and figure out what to do with them. And there are a variety of options, right? You can get a hold of them and encourage them to, roll their assets to their new employer or to an IRA. You could get a hold of them and just make sure you have their address. You're now in contact. They stay in the plan. Everything's fine from that perspective. If they have a balance that's below $7,000, you can use a safe harbor fiduciary process that lets you roll their money into an IRA for them, even if they're not easy for you to get in contact otherwise. So there's a variety of ways to clean this up so that you can reduce missing participants you may have collected over the years. And a lot of record keepers have sort of enhanced search programs where they look at death records and credit records and those kinds of things to find folks. DOL put out some guidance on about something like 12 different things you can try. They're not all applicable to every plan, and they're not a true checklist. But I'd much rather have you all show in one of your committee meetings that, hey, we looked at missing participants, we found how many we had, or a rough approximation. We decided to go to the record keeper and have their enhanced program track them down. Doing that is going to give you a lot of protection from any, say, DOL investigation or argument they can make in the future because you took a proactive step to address the issue. So that's one of them. Another one is cybersecurity. DOL wants to make sure that you're taking that seriously. For the average plan, what I would say that means is when you do an RFP for a service provider, especially record keepers or custodians, ask them about their cybersecurity. Make sure that's one of the questions so that in your file on each of your service providers, you have information that says, yes, we have good cybersecurity, and here's some description of it. So you can show that you've taken that into account. Otherwise, the biggest favorite violation DOL finds the most common when it does investigations are what they call delinquent contributions. So how long does it take you to get money from payroll withholding? So like I say, I want to put 5% in my pay in my 401k. How long does it take you to, from the time payroll takes that 5% out until it gets into the trust account? And if you're a plan with 100 or fewer participants, if you do that within 7 business days, it's deemed always timely. If you're more than 100 participants, it comes down to what's our normal process. You want to be pretty routine in how you do this. An excessive delay gets you in trouble. Being inconsistent in how you do it can get you in trouble. Best to have a steady, reliable process that in a few days gets the money from withholding to the trust to avoid this issue. I can keep going, but we're down to like 2 minutes.
No, thank you, sir.
So I thought I'd better take a breath there.
Well, and I think we got to everything. And Adam and Scott, that I can always get questions to Brad if you or your clients have them. But any questions you have briefly as we get here to the end?
No, I just want to thank both of you, Jeff and Brad, for joining us. It's super helpful. Jeff and I are not related, by the way. I forgot to say that at the beginning. But thanks for Federated Hermes for helping us put this on. And Adam and I are planning on doing a series of virtual education sessions, and I think this is a great start. 2 things that we're seeing. One, these 401k plans are working because people are retiring. As people are getting older, either the market growth is helping or they're doing a good job saving, and we're having a lot of turnover in our committee members, from either retirement or just job changing. So with that, just a number of new clients joining us, and so we're definitely trying to educate, and we have additional fiduciary training if you're interested that we can send you. But we're excited about being able to post this replay and show it to new committee members and things like that so that they can kind of get a frame of reference of where we're coming from. So with that, I think we're at 12 and it was perfect. And appreciate you guys again for making this happen. So,
gentlemen, anytime. Thank you for having us.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Have a nice holidays. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.